So the title here is, well, Reality Plus from the Matrix to the Metaverse. And yeah, Reality Plus is the title of a recent book that I published a couple of months ago. And yeah, only after publishing the book did it occur to me that I could have put some of the major themes in terms of these two major fables from science fiction, the story of the Matrix and the story of the Metaverse. I will use those today in my talk to structure some of the major themes in this book. The talk will go over a number of the central theses and contentions that I tried to argue for in Reality Plus. There's the book. The subtitle of the book is Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy. So it's really meant to be thinking philosophically about virtual worlds and virtual reality technology and seeing what light this kind of technology can shed on some quite traditional problems in philosophy. This is an instance of a genre that I call technophilosophy. Herman was just talking about this in the last talk at some length, very interestingly. So I don't know whether everybody here was in the previous talk, so maybe I'll just review the idea briefly. I see technophilosophy as having two central strands: using philosophy to shed light on technology, thinking philosophically about, say, AI, about virtual reality, about the internet, about computers in general. That sometimes gets called the philosophy of technology and is, I think, widely recognized branch of philosophy. But I think equally important, and maybe what's especially distinctive here, is using technology to shed light on philosophy. Using ideas drawn from technology to actually help illuminate and maybe even make some progress with traditional philosophical problems. I don't think technophilosophy is something new. I think it's been around for a long time in many domains, but I think it is worth highlighting. And I think with the increasing role of technology in our lives, it's becoming all the more interesting and relevant. I mean, you might ask, as Herman did in the last talk, why is technology especially interesting here for shedding light on philosophy? I mean, there are, of course, many things that can be used to shed light on philosophy. I'm a pluralist about philosophy. I think we should find tools for doing philosophy wherever we can. But I think technology is distinctive for a couple of reasons, most notably because technology is, very much the domain of the artificial. And I think the artificial is extremely interesting for a number of philosophical purposes. I mean, I think of philosophy as all about the mind and the world and the relationship between them. And we start from our standard case, the human mind, the mind we have, the physical world, the world we have. And we think about the mind and we think about the world through that lens. But suddenly with technology, we have artificial minds and we have artificial worlds, which I think provide a lot of, provide a new resource for doing philosophy. I mean, this is very clear, I think, in the realm of artificial intelligence, where I think AI-based technophilosophy has been around for a very long time. Philosophers have been thinking about AI for a long time. I mean, AI is basically, the domain, if you like, you can think of it as the domain of, at least in part, of artificial minds. We go beyond the human mind to artificial minds, and analysis and reflection on artificial minds, I think, just has the capacity to shed much light on minds in general, on what is it to have a mind, on what is the space of possible minds, what forms can a mind take, what kind of features are relevant or constitutive of having a mind. And this comes up, of course, not just for having a mind, but for any number of mental concepts, whether it's consciousness or intelligence or learning or language or communication, as Herman was talking about. And I think this can certainly take many forms. It could be conceptual analysis. It could be conceptual engineering, Herman's program in the last talk. Maybe this will help us develop new concepts. It could be a new form of metaphysical analysis. I'm again a pluralist about technophilosophy, and I think it can, reflections on artificial minds, encounters with artificial minds, I think can really help us think about the mind in general. I think about the case of the extended mind that Andy Clark and I started to think about in the 90s, to a certain extent driven by technology, thinking about the technology of the internet as showing ways that the mind can extend. But then in the last 20 years, through actual encounters with extensions of the mind, encounters with technology, such as most obviously the ubiquity of the smartphone, I think everyone's conception of at least our own conception of the extended mind has greatly deepened through this encounter with the technology. And arguably this has led to some kind of transformation of our concepts of the mind already. So this is the case of artificial minds. In the book Reality Plus, I'm especially concerned with artificial worlds or artificial realities. The book is especially focused on virtual worlds and virtual realities. I mean, what is a virtual world? It's basically an artificial world or an artificial reality. And I think just as analysis of artificial minds sheds much light on minds in general, I think that analysis of artificial realities sheds much light on reality in general. And that will include on our illuminating our concepts of reality and perhaps even transforming or engineering some of those concepts of reality, but also helping us to reflect on, what is it to know the external world, what constitutes a reality. Again, just thinking about artificial realities provides, suddenly we've got this, we've moved beyond the data point of n equals 1, one reality we're dealing with, all these other realities. And I think it just has the prospect to shed a lot of light on reality in general. So quite a lot of what I do in this book, Reality Plus, I mean, some large part of it is thinking about VR in its own right, but another large part is to see what light this can shed on philosophical questions about reality in general. And in what follows, I'll do a little bit of each, I think, of both strands of techno-philosophy, thinking about VR in its own right and seeing what light it can shed on reality in general. So let me just define a few terms here. A virtual world I take to be an interactive, computer-generated world. So here's a paradigmatic virtual world, the virtual world of World of Warcraft. It's a three-dimensional world, although experienced typically on a two-dimensional computer screen. It's interactive. You can act on that world and it will act back on you. It's all basically generated by a computer. This is a video game world, but here's a non-video game world. This is the world, the virtual world of Second Life. Again, where people, adopt avatars and interact within this computer-generated world, again, typically on a two-dimensional screen. So these two are not yet virtual realities in the standard language. The standard language of virtual reality is an immersive virtual world, an immersive, interactive, computer-generated world. And to be immersive means you experience it from the inside in 3 dimensions, typically these days with a virtual reality headset. Here, the Oculus Quest or the Meta Quest. You put on the headset and suddenly you're immersively experiencing a 3-dimensional world all around you and interacting with it. Here is the game Beat Saber that you can play inside a virtual reality headset, try and slice cubes with a lightsaber. Here is a social virtual world, the world of VR chat. where again you adopt an avatar and you socialize. Well, here is a mixed reality too. This is the augmented reality glasses introduced by Magic Leap, where you get to experience both physical world and virtual objects mixed in with the physical world, what's often called an augmented or mixed reality. So I'm interested in this technology in its own right, and because I think it's philosophically fascinating and for its relevance to many philosophical questions. The central thesis of this book, Reality Plus, is that virtual reality is genuine reality. There's a long tradition of seeing virtual reality as a fake or fictional reality, an illusion, a hallucination, a second-class reality. I want to say no. In the domain of AI, many people have embraced the thesis that artificial minds are genuine minds. I'm inclined to accept that thesis about AI. Think of this as a counterpart thesis about VR. Virtual reality is genuine reality. And that thesis has a number of elements. One, perhaps the strongest and most speculative, is that physical reality, the reality we started with, might itself be a virtual reality. We might be in a virtual reality already, and that corresponds to the well-known simulation hypothesis, that we could be in a computer simulation. I don't say we are, but I don't think we can rule it out. Getting closer to questions about existing virtual reality technology, I also want to say virtual reality is not an illusion or a fiction. Maybe in some cases it can generate illusions, but it needn't. In virtual reality, things can be very much the way they appear to be. Many of the things we believe about the world still come out true. And third is a thesis about meaning or value, that we can lead a meaningful life in virtual reality. And what follows, I'll focus on each of these, starting with the case, the more science fiction style case of the universe as a simulation, and getting to the more practical case of the technology we are now developing. I think of the science fiction case as corresponding to the Matrix. The Matrix stands for the simulation hypothesis, the hypothesis that we are right now in a virtual world. And the metaverse, on the other hand, which comes from Neil Stephenson's science fiction novel, Snow Crash, but it's come to be adopted for the coming technology of virtual worlds, or as it's sometimes put, the immersive internet. And this is the metaverse here stands for the virtual worlds that we will ourselves be creating. So what I'll do here is talk a little about the broader, the more speculative idea that we're ourselves in a virtual world, and then get to the more practical questions about the virtual worlds we may create. Okay, so let me start with the speculative part, the simulation hypothesis. The hypothesis that we are ourselves in a lifelong computer simulation, famously illustrated in movies like The Matrix, where there is a giant computer simulation that people seem to be inhabiting. Could that be happening to us? Of course, we just had the Matrix Resurrections just 3 months ago now, release illustrating this idea all over again, that we might actually be inhabiting such a simulated world. Here's an illustration from Reality Plus. A marvelous illustrator, Tim Peacock, came up with 57 illustrations, which really helped to illuminate many philosophical ideas. This is a scene involving two characters from The Matrix, the Trinity and the Oracle, both of whom inhabit the Matrix in slightly different ways. Trinity is what I call a biosim. She's actually got a biological brain and body, which is hooked up to this computer simulation. The Oracle is herself a simulated creature. She's part of the simulation. She's an AI program running wholly off computer technology herself. So the oracle is what I call a pure sim. Trinity is what I call a biosim. I think both of these are ways of inhabiting a simulation. And when I speak of the simulation hypothesis, the hypothesis that we are in a simulation, it's meant to cover both cases. We could be biosims, we could be pure sims. So yeah, a biosim is a biological creature connected to a simulation. A pure sim is a simulated creature. Another distinction is the distinction between an imperfect simulation that has lots of glitches and shortcuts and approximations that could in principle be detected, from a perfect simulation, a simulation that's indistinguishable from the world that it simulates. And I guess, the perfect simulation is in some ways the purest philosophical distillation of the simulation idea. The simulation hypothesis immediately once you have simulations on the table, it just immediately raises these questions. How do you know you're not in a simulation right now? Especially, how could you know you're not in a perfect simulation right now? You might think you've got some evidence for this, but it's hard to see how you could at least have conclusive evidence you're not in a simulation, because it sure looks like, in principle, any evidence could itself be simulated in a good enough, perfect simulation. So this is all, wonderful grist for a philosophical mill. The ideas here are certainly not especially new ideas in philosophy. You can find elements of this. Well, you can find elements of this back in Zhuangzi with his story of the butterfly dream, where first he has a dream of being a butterfly and then wakes up as Zhuangzi and raises the question, well, how do I know that I'm Zhuangzi who just dreamed he was a butterfly? For all I know, I could be a butterfly who's now dreaming that he's Zhuangzi. So that's the dream hypothesis as laid out in Zhuangzi. In early modern French philosophy, we have René Descartes' famous Meditations on First Philosophy, where he spells out a number of skeptical challenges, including how do you know you're not dreaming right now? But perhaps most famously, how do you know an evil demon isn't deceiving you by producing sensations of an external world, when none of it is real? And in a way, here's Descartes' evil demon. And the thought is, well, in a way, the simulation hypothesis is a way of fleshing out and making concrete this idea. The conceit behind this picture is the evil demon might actually do its work by creating a computer simulation, connecting it to a brain in a vat. And, the brain in a vat is following Descartes' advice and reasoning and says, well, okay, not sure about external reality, but I know I'm here thinking. I think, therefore I am. But it still raises a skeptical question about the external world. So I think of the simulation hypothesis as very much continuous with this grand tradition of skeptical hypotheses about dreams and demons and so on. These days, for students, it's very natural to ask the question, how do you know you're not in a simulation? How do you know you're not in a matrix? That's the version of this that corresponds to contemporary technology. So at the very least, it's a very nice illustration of the idea that using things that contemporary technology makes concrete. You could raise Descartes' question about how he knows that his senses aren't fooling him by the hypothesis that could Descartes himself be in a virtual reality as depicted here. I actually think the simulation hypothesis improves on Descartes' on these traditional arguments in a couple of respects, but I think most centrally that as VR technology is developing, it's becoming a more serious possibility. Many people respond to the story of the evil demon and so on by saying this is a very distant possible world, and we don't have any reason to take it as a serious possibility. Whereas as VR technology is developing, this is technology that we will actually have, probably quite possibly within decades, we will be able to put people into extremely convincing simulations of physical reality. That technology will be something that exists. It will no longer be a distant possibility. It may actually, the technology itself will be an existing possibility, which I think is relevant. I mean, Descartes took the seriousness of, the liveness of these possibilities, given the evidence we have, to be relevant to their success as arguments. There's also the more specific point, which has been developed especially by Nick Bostrom, that simulated worlds may greatly outnumber unsimulated worlds. Here's the idea that as technology develops, there'll be many more simulated worlds and unsimulated worlds. Here we have a conversation between Bostrom and Bertrand Russell. Russell says, well, ordinary reality is the simplest hypothesis. Bostrom says, but there may be many more simulations. And here the illustration shows, okay, we have 216 simulated versions of this conversation, only one unsimulated version of the conversation. So you could make the argument that actually statistically, you ought to make it, take it to be much more probable than not that you're in a simulation. I think there's a lot to say about that argument, but in the book, I argue that actually the simulation argument is in a certain way the nail in the coffin in the idea that we can know we're not in a simulation. And I do think this is something that turns, in some ways, essentially on technology. It's because we have this technology of simulated worlds that we expect that so many simulated worlds will be created at some point in the universe. And it's that makes it, especially hard to rule out the hypothesis that we're in a simulation. So I think that's a point where, for example, the technology is playing some reasonably essential role. In other cases, in these techno-philosophical arguments, I don't think I need to insist that technology is playing an essential role. It may be that it's playing an illuminating role, or it's playing a role that could, in principle, have been played by something non-technological. But nonetheless, I think that, technology is often particularly well suited to play those roles, and actually in practice can drive us towards philosophically illuminating conclusions. Okay, so but I take the upshot of all this to be that at least we can't know we're not in a simulation. I don't say we are in a simulation, but I see lots of reasons now, some given by the technology, to think that we can't know we're not in a simulation. So many people think, okay, that's bad news. It can be combined with further argument to get to really negative conclusions about knowledge. Premise one, we can't know we're not in a simulation. Premise two, if we're in a simulation, nothing is real. Conclusion, we can't know anything is real. So you might, okay, that's now a classic skeptical argument from philosophy. We've actually, in a way, supported that argument with the technology by arguing for premise one. In what follows, I'm going to argue against premise two, but premise two does have, a fair amount going for it. This gets us to premise two gets us to our second question. Are simulations illusions? It's a very common view that virtual realities are illusory realities. Simulated universes are illusory universes. And if you accept that, then you'll accept the second premise of the argument I just outlined. Oh, here's the American philosopher Cornel West expressing this view. He actually acted in The Matrix, and his character, Counselor West, is here depicted escaping from the Matrix to the world of Zion around it, and then he escapes beyond it to the world of the US. He says, well, it's illusions all the way down. All these simulations are illusions, as may this reality. This reality itself may be an illusion. My view is simulations need not be illusions. If we're in a perfect simulation, the world around us is still perfectly real. I mean, some of this depends on the philosophical question of how you define reality, what it means to be real. Here we have Morpheus raising that question. Well, Neo in The Matrix says, this is not real. Morpheus says, what is real? How do you define real? And that is itself a very interesting question. Herman raised this. It raises issues both of conceptual analysis. What does it mean in existing language, and conceptual engineering? What should the word real mean? It's a complex question, but to distill, I mean, in the book, I distinguish 5 strands of talk about reality, of which perhaps the most central are the following 3. Something is real if it makes a difference. That is, it has causal powers in reality. If it's not all in the mind, if something happens totally within the mind, then we often take it not to be real. And third, perhaps most importantly, that it's not an illusion. Something is real if roughly it's the way it seems to be. Anyway, I want to argue that virtual worlds in general, and in particular, the virtual world of of the matrix or of the simulation hypothesis is real in all these senses. I want to say, if we're in a simulation, the objects around us are real digital objects. They're digital objects existing on a computer, but they're nonetheless concrete objects and processes for all that. They make a difference in the world. They're not all in the mind. And most importantly, they're not an illusion. I go on to argue that if we're in a simulation, yeah, it seems to me that there's a chair out there in space. There really is a chair out there in space. Yes, it's a digital chair, which is out there in a digital space, but nonetheless, it's perfectly real. Nonetheless, it is very roughly the way it seems to be. It's a chair with a certain shape out there in space. All that is not an illusion. I want to argue then that being digital is no worse than being made of, say, quantum processes here. I mean, some of this turns on the word real and exactly what one counts as real, but I think the deepest point here is one about sort of reality and illusion, but whether in these situations the world is as it seems to be. I don't think that point fundamentally turns on, the semantics of the word real. It's a matter of the match between mind and reality. And I want to argue, even in simulated worlds, that that match can be there. I mean, the simulation hypothesis is a version of the so-called it from bit hypothesis, on my view. This is an idea that you find in physics. Everything in the physical world is made of bits. This is not itself regarded as a skeptical hypothesis. This is a metaphysical hypothesis about what the world is made of. Reality is made of bits. I want to argue that if the simulation hypothesis is true, then so is the it from bit hypothesis, and vice versa. It's just a reality which at some level is digital. It's made of bits, but nonetheless objects are real. Here's a picture of the it from bit hypothesis. Yeah, trees made of atoms, made of a level of bits, possibly with something even deeper beneath the bits. And here's I try to argue that the simulation hypothesis is equivalent to a version of what I call the it from bit creation hypothesis. That, yeah, if we're in a simulation, here's a way that God might have created the world. God might have created a collection of bits in which all physical reality is grounded. And I want to say, if we're in a simulation, here's the simulator of God creating our reality by programming a computer to create some bits. I want to argue these two situations are on a par. And this is, again, I think, a case where thinking about technology, about this idea from it from bit, can really drive us towards recognizing the simulation hypothesis as a distinctive metaphysics. It's not to say that one couldn't do that without the it from bit hypothesis. Some of these points, I think, can ultimately be put in terms of structural realism and the structural or mathematical nature of our grip on the world. And we find the structure in our conception of the physical world can also be present in a simulation. But again, I find that thinking about it through the lens of technology often provides some serious guidance in coming to grips with these ideas. So to conclude the matrix or simulation part of the talk, I would say, yes, we could be in a simulation. That's the bad news. However, there's also good news. if we're in a simulation, things are perfectly real. So the mere possibility that we're in a simulation doesn't threaten the reality of the external world and doesn't threaten our knowledge of the external world. So that's already, I think, a place where thinking this way can help us with some quite traditional philosophical problems. And this gets us halfway, at least, to this conclusion. Virtual reality is genuine reality. In the time remaining, I want to focus on some somewhat more practical issues now tied to the virtual worlds that we will be creating in the coming decades. This is an enterprise which is now often gets subsumed under the label of the metaverse, where the metaverse is, the coming interconnected network of virtual augmented worlds, the new immersive generation of the internet. I mean, the term metaverse, as I was saying, was introduced by Neil Stephenson in Snow Crash in '92, where it was a single massive social virtual world, a little like, say, Second Life, except experienced in extremely high-tech, immersive technology. And for a while, people talked about building a metaverse or building metaverses where a metaverse would be a single massive virtual world. These days, I think the term metaverse has been somewhat rebranded, actually in an act of at least so far successful conceptual engineering. I think Mark Zuckerberg came out with his speech back in, I think it was October, where he renamed Facebook Meta to label their ambitions of pursuing the metaverse, leading to a whole lot of excitement about the metaverse. And now I think at this point, the term metaverse has come to mean something slightly different, something like a global interconnected system of virtual worlds. The immersive, sometimes said the immersive internet, just to be say, the internet is not something local, it's the whole network. Likewise, the metaverse is the new generation of the internet, maybe to be built 10 or 20 years in the future, which is fully immersive. And actually, I think this is an instance where the concept is very much up for grabs. Many people are saying, no, this is what matters for the metaverse. It's not virtual reality, it's blockchain, maybe it's augmented this and that, maybe video games count. The term is actually contested because it's right now regarded as a label for, whatever good things we're interested in happening in the future, in the near vicinity. It's very much a term that's still somewhat up for grabs, but I'll use it to serve as a label for the virtual worlds we'll be building in coming decades. Or here's a somewhat dystopian illustration of the metaverse, illustrated using as a version of Plato's cave. In Plato's cave, the prisoners are chained up, looking at the cave wall, and this is meant to be very undesirable. Here we have instead prisoners chained to virtual reality, looking at images from VR, and I guess that's Mark Zuckerberg running the whole simulation. You might think this is the dystopian version of VR. I will try to argue for a somewhat less dystopian conception of VR and the metaverse. I mean, the metaverse is somewhat different from the Matrix. You don't spend your whole life in the metaverse. You enter virtual worlds and then you leave them. You're using VR when you're using it. It's also far simpler than a universe simulation. It may just be some very local worlds with some much simpler technology. But nevertheless, I think some of the issues are continuous. For example, is the metaverse a world of illusions? Many people say yes. Here's William Gibson back in Neuromancer, where he introduced the term cyberspace. At the time, I think he meant the term cyberspace to mean what we now mean by roughly the space of virtual reality. It's interesting, but it later came to mean something more like the space of the internet, and VR got dropped from the meaning of cyberspace. But interesting bit of conceptual evolution or engineering. What the cyberspace originally meant, according to Gibson, is very roughly what the metaverse now means, according to Zuckerberg. And we've seen interesting parallel evolution of both terms in different directions. But Gibson said cyberspace is a consensual hallucination experienced daily by billions of people. Keyword hallucination. Even Gibson thought VR is a kind of hallucination Ready Player One, you see, reality is the only thing that's real. That's to say, by which I think they meant physical reality is real, virtual reality is not. So again, you get this line, VR is not fully real. Very common view, virtual objects are unreal, they're illusions, they're hallucinations, they're fictions. In my view, all that is wrong. Virtual objects are real. They're non-illusory digital objects. And I already argued for that in the case of a universe simulation. I think you can also make that case just in the case of ordinary VR. If we're in a full-scale simulation, to be sure, we're interacting with real digital objects running on a computer. I would generalize that to ordinary VR. The objects we're interacting with are still real digital objects running on a computer. I've got this case of it. Here's a biological kitten, a robot kitten, and a virtual kitten. I want to say they're different. The robot kitten and the virtual kitten are not biological kittens. If you like, you can say they're not real kittens, although we might eventually change our usage of that term. But they are real objects. They all have causal powers. They all make a difference. I want to say the virtual kitten is at least as real as, say, the robot kitten. So I mean, all of these are real. The virtual kitten is a real digital object that we can interact with. There's also the question, is VR an illusion? You might say, even if these are real digital objects, maybe they have properties they don't seem to have. Things seem to be out in physical space where they, in fact, are not. I think this is interestingly complex, but what I would argue is that while novice users of VR may experience objects as being in physical space, that may be a kind of illusion. I would argue that sophisticated or expert users of VR experience objects around them as being in a virtual space. They're virtual objects in a virtual space. That's how we experience them. And I would say that does not need to be an illusion. So I would say that expert users of VR have non-illusory perception of virtual worlds. So that then gets me to my second main conclusion, which is VR need not be an illusion. The third part is about questions about meaning and value. Since time is gradually running down, maybe I'll just go through this rather briskly. Here the structural question is, can one have a meaningful life in a virtual world, or a good life in virtual world? There's a long tradition of philosophers saying no to questions like this. The American philosopher Robert Nozick had his famous fable of the experience machine, saying, just say you could live in an experience machine, which would live out an amazing script where you have a wonderful, successful life. In this picture, the conceit is that Nozick himself might be in the experience machine. He's a successful Harvard professor, winning awards for his books, just the kind of thing someone might experience in the experience machine. And anyway, Nozick asks, would you enter the experience machine? And says, no, we shouldn't. And many people have taken this to be his reasons to enter the experience machine to also be reasons not to enter virtual reality. The main reasons are that arguably the experience machine is pre-programmed, so you live out a script, you don't have free will or autonomy. The experience machine is illusory. The experience machine is artificial. In the book, I argue that none of these are good reasons not to enter VR. The experience machine may live out a pre-programmed script. VR didn't do that. You enter a social virtual world, you still get to use free will, you still get to exert autonomy. Your life is not scripted. You get to make your own future, build your communities, build your relationships. I'd also argue VR is not illusory. I've already made that case. And I'd say, sure, VR may be artificial, but so are many of the environments we now live in. Many of us live in cities. It's artificial. It's not so bad. It's still meaningful. So my view is that our lives have their meaning and value because of the experiences that we have, the relationships that we build, the projects that we undertake, the achievements that we make, and so on. I think all of that can be present in a sophisticated virtual world. And indeed, you'll find versions of all of this even in some existing virtual worlds. So this is not there's no obvious bar to having a fully meaningful life in VR. I do think VR may be missing some sources of value for some people. If you really value contact with nature, for example, VR won't give you that. It's artificial almost by nature. Some people value that, but I think it's an optional value. I'd also say that VR has new sources of value, new forms of embodiment, new forms of experience, near unlimited space, an abundance of goods, potentially. It's much easier to manufacture things in VR, instant travel. So I'd say in the long term, it's rational for some people to prefer physical reality, but also rational for others to prefer VR. Here's an illustration of the choice. You could, go live life in a virtual reality or a corresponding terraform reality on a terraformed planet. Let's say, I want to say they're roughly as attractive as each other. Either choice could be rational. So I'd say, you can live a meaningful life in VR. That's not to say it's going to be a utopia. Life in VR may be good or it may be awful, but I'd say the full scale of human experience is available. There's also the question of whether the prospect of life in VR is utopian or dystopian. Here, I guess I'm inclined to say probably somewhere in between. It has both elements. On the utopian side, I've already mentioned, new bodies, new forms of experience, near unlimited space, virtual abundance. You can see all kinds of utopian possibilities there. But there are also dystopian possibilities. I mean, right now, most virtual worlds are controlled by corporations. It's roughly we have forms of government by corporation in these virtual worlds, corporations almost serving as the gods of these worlds. I hope that in the long term, we'll have forms of virtual worlds that don't take this form, because obviously, the creator of a virtual world is godlike. They've got omniscience, they're potentially all-knowing about what goes on in that world, raising privacy issues. They're omnipotent, raising issues of manipulation of users of virtual worlds. There's issues of unequal access, not to mention issues of neglect of the physical world, all of which raise potential, dystopian potential for virtual worlds as well. So I think the utopian and the dystopian potential are both there. They coexist as they do, for example, on the internet. Is the internet a utopia or a dystopia? Neither. It's brought wonderful things. It's brought awful things. I think in the case of the internet, the net value is still fairly clearly being positive. I guess in my optimistic moments, hopefully the metaverse will be like the internet. The net value will be positive. But anyway, I think I am running out of time. So then I'll just repeat my final slogan. Virtual reality is genuine reality. And I'll say the rest is up to us. Thank you.